This is the first seminar, as I was saying, of the 2023-24 school year. As you know, La Torre will continue to offer its 3 permanent courses, which are the Diálogos of La Torre del Virrey, a normal life seminar of therapeutic philosophy, and philosophy. Besides these, coming this September is the Empty House. Anyway, these previous words were and to calm my nerves a little bit, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm really excited and happy and honored and introducing and welcoming William Altman to our seminar this evening. Even though it's hard to imagine that Will needs an introduction at this point. He has been a companion along the journey. In 2019, some of us, referred to as we feel, we have to feel, had the pleasure of meeting him in person when he came to give us 2 lectures on the Platonic paradigm shift expanded in his work. Of course, that was the seed that introduced the idea of reading all of the Platonic dialogues and letters following the reading order, from which Los Diálogos de la Torre del Virrey sprouted in 2021. In 2021-2022, we started in the Pythagoras and reached the Ion. And the following school year, we sprinted from Menexenos all the way to Plato. And not only he has shown us the pedagogical order to which we undertook the adventure of becoming Platonic philosophers, Will has gathered in his work a complete bibliography, both ancient and modern, of Platonic studies, that in a sense too can be interpreted as a list of great books on Plato. But if you'll allow me this little joke, while these great books about Plato can be considered as footnotes to Plato, I would like to call them the footnotes to Plato. These books that follow Plato's teaching, the first one on Xenophon, the second one to the subject in Plato the teacher. But more important than that, I think, is that he has provided us with a unique terminology that we can no longer avoid so easily when and while we're trying to make some sense of the things that perplexes us in the Platonic text. Terms like proleptic, basanistic, and visionary elements are key and have been a topic of discussion oftentimes during our seminars. Or the necessity of both the shorter and longer ways of the Republic to make the idea of justice shine forth. And since I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to mention some of my favorites, the image of Platonism as the division sign, the California consultant as the harmonious man, or the KGB as the acronym for knowledge of good and bad. A way back then, when we read Lovers, we found a passage that Will pointed out in Ascent to the Beautiful as a reference to Plato the teacher, whom he identified as the seat sower of studies. In a sense, then, Will has become too the seat sower of studies to our own humble country and virtual academy, trying to do the best it can. So, in short, it is indeed an honor, a privilege, but above all, a beautiful delight to present William Altman, who is not only our teacher, but a friend, a philos, and an example of the joy of the philosophic spirit. Brevemente, sabéis que tenemos unos cuantos seminarios, uno de ellos este mismo mes, el de la Casa Vacía. He presentado a Altman como el sembrador de estudios de nuestra pequeña academia virtual y le he agradecido que nos haya dado los términos con los que debatir en nuestra sala virtual, en nuestras clases, en nuestras lecturas, místico, visionario, político, que ha dado tantos problemas y tantos debates en nuestro... en nuestras discusiones de los diálogos. Hemos empezado a leer los diálogos, hemos alcanzado la República este año y creo que este es el mejor trampolín que podemos tener para dar el salto. Así que
Well, muchas gracias a todos. Buenas tardes. Gracias por atender. Muchas gracias, María. Ahora milagrosamente puedo hablar contigo en español. No tengo palabras ni siquiera en inglés para expresarle mi gratitud por su traducción de Platón, el maestro. Gracias. So, with that as the extent of what I can tell you in Spanish, I'll read my paper. The important thing of the paper really is just to get you to ask questions afterwards. So the question is, why read Plato's Republic? Preceded by Homer, the tragedians, and the historians, then followed by Aristotle and his criticisms in the politics, Plato's Republic is a virtually constitutive part of any curriculum based on the great books of Western civilization. As a result, the question, why read Plato's Republic, implicates more basic questions like, why read the great books, or even, why be a well-educated person? In the context of great books, Cicero, Augustine, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Hegel continue and constitute an ongoing dialogue that arises from Plato's political theorizing. But the inevitability of its inclusion in any such list comes at an unremarked cost to Plato. His most famous dialogue is situated and ultimately has become entangled in a series of writings that threatens to conceal Plato's own purpose in writing it. And thanks primarily to Aristotle's criticisms, it is most easily read and interpreted as a utopian political program of dubious practicality. In short, the easiest answer to the question, why read Plato's Republic, implicates an easy but ultimately inadequate answer to the question, how should we read and think about Plato's Republic? Part of what makes the Republic an inevitable choice for inclusion in a series of great books is that Plato himself is clearly responding in it to his own great literary predecessors and his readers' familiarity with Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Simonides, Aristophanes, and Thucydides, to name just the most obvious, is presumed throughout. In his Republic, Plato, in a sense, created the first curriculum based on a series of great books, the series of literary predecessors it presupposes and was intended to complete. Plato was an Athenian, and it is the great and influential Athens of Plato's youth, fountainhead of democracy, tragedy, and dialogue, that lives on in his masterpiece. In a literary sense, the all-night conversation that it depicts is indeed a celebration of the goddess Athena and of her city's unique place and towering importance in the collective experience of humanity, as preserved by her writers and Plato's predecessors. Indeed, a celebration of wisdom and that love of wisdom that is philosophy. The wondrous creativity that the love of wisdom engendered in Athens likewise remains eternally fresh and young, and Plato's Republic, not surprisingly, teems with bold and innovative ideas. The proposal that men and women are equally fit to serve the ideal city as its warrior guardians is the paradigmatic example. But then again, what could we expect from Athena's city, except a conception of feminine power and wisdom that it has taken millennia for mankind to recover? One could make a long list of the proposals, claims, and thoughts that Plato included in his Republic that have made and will continue to make it a fertile source of lively discussion and debate, almost as if generating that debate had been the dialogue's true purpose. And what else would we expect a great book to do, especially when so many other later great books have made it possible to imagine them as a series of footnotes to Plato? The problem is that by embedding Plato's Republic in such a series, it has inevitably come to take on a meaning and significance foreign to the dialogue itself. And rather than explain why we should read it in the context of books that respond to it, it is no less helpful to consider it, or rather a single excerpt from it, on its own. It is for good reason that the allegory of the cave in the 7th book of the Republic is the most frequently excerpted passage from it, and indeed from the writings of Plato as a whole. It contains the essence of Platonism, the uniquely Platonic view that reduces the visible world, the material world of pre-Socratic and also modern philosophy, to the status of shadows on the back wall of a cave. As expressed by Socrates, philosophy required a radical reorientation away from the material to the spiritual, and by reducing the cave to unreality in comparison with the ultimate source of goodness outside of it, Plato provided a better answer to the question, why read Plato's Republic, than its place in a series of great books can possibly provide. The allegory is, to begin with, the perfect expression of the word education. The student starts in ignorance, believing falsehoods to be true and unrealities to be unquestionable. Overcoming this initial darkness is difficult, and it requires the student to question and ultimately to reject a series of views upon which most of us have constructed our image of the world, which in German is called a Weltanschauung. The reorientation at the center of the allegory turns us away from the world, away from the familiar, away from what the collective opinion of mankind regards as not only true, but as unquestionably true, just as if anyone who questions its existence and power was necessarily benighted and confused. The erstwhile prisoner must be led out of the cave, and the etymology of the Latin verb educere is nowhere better illustrated than in a few vivid and beautifully written pages of Plato's Republic. It is not, of course, only this famous allegory that is well written, and when Plato made the decision to begin his masterpiece with the Greek word kateben, meaning I went down, he revealed both his literary genius and the inadequacy of reading the Republic as a paradigmatic example of utopian political theorizing to which a long series of later thinkers, beginning with Aristotle, would respond. The actual subject of Plato's Republic is justice, and above all, why we should choose to be just. And even though the cave allegory is exerted because it so perfectly illustrates the kind of emancipation from ignorance that is a true education, it also turns out to illustrate equally perfectly the essence of justice, not instantiated in the student's release from the chains and the shadows of unreality, but rather in the even more difficult choice to return to the darkness in the light of a greater good, having first escaped from them. With Socrates, both Plato and his students can say, I escaped the cave, but returned to it. In short, can say, kateben, I went down. The reason we should read Plato's Republic is that it is a book that demands to be read. And by this, I mean, to be read carefully and repeatedly, a book whose essence is revealed only to those who know how to read with care. There is a reason why so many have read Plato's Republic as the description of an ideal city, teeming with shocking proposals of dubious practicality. On the surface, it must be said to invite such a reason. The turning point occurs in Book 4, where Socrates, having defined justice in the city as each of its three classes performing the one task appropriate to it, he prefaces the analogous discussion of justice in the individual with a warning that the methods they are presently using fall short of the precision required, and that there is a, quote, longer and harder way, close quote, that alone would conduce to the desired result. This longer way is mentioned again in Book 6. And with the idea of the good, it introduces the three great images in Plato's masterpiece: the sun, the line, and the cave. Here is the critical and introductory passage in Book 4, easily overlooked, but essential to an adequate reading of Plato's Republic, and thus illuminating the necessary how, without which no adequate answer to the question why can be properly answered. Quote, "But if something else should manifest itself in the individual, going back up to the city, we will test it, and perhaps, examining the two side by side and comparing them, as if by rubbing together two fire sticks, we make justice shine forth, and having once become visible, we may confirm it in ourselves." Close quote. The language used here will reappear in the 7th of Plato's letters, where he explains in his own voice, for a change, why he cannot commit his most important thoughts to writing. In fact, the two passages reveal the manner in which he can, and indeed already has, committed his most important thought to writing, the thought that caused him to create the academy in Athens and to write his famous Republic for the benefit of those who attended it and also for the benefit of those who didn't. Just as the surface of the Republic is an ideal city, its essence is only revealed by following a longer way. It is this complex text division into both shorter and longer ways that make it rather the equivalent of those two fire sticks, where we will only see justice itself by comparing the foundational claim that each will do the one job for which they are naturally suited with the more inspiring but difficult claim that justice requires the philosopher to say, "I went down," by first escaping from and then returning to the dark cave of political life. The essential difference between the shorter and the longer ways is that only the latter involves the idea of the good, and that for a very good reason. Along the shorter way, Socrates can prove to Plato's brothers and the rest of us that choosing justice is good for us, benefits us, and conduces to our happiness, whereas true justice is choice-worthy simply in the light of what is absolutely good, the inspiring basis of Plato's true idealism. Aristotle famously rejected Plato's idea of the good and located the good for mankind in our happiness. And along the shorter way, thanks to the demand made by Plato's two brothers at the beginning of the second book in the dialogue, that is how Socrates justifies the choice for justice, ultimately showing that the just man is 729 times happier than the tyrant. Fully dependent on the analogy between the city and the man, this ongoing argument has made it possible to attribute Aristotle's explicit commitment to eudaimonism to Plato as well. In his Politics, Aristotle not only reads Plato's Republic as first and foremost a series of debatable proposals for an ideal city, but dismisses as extraneous to its true subject the education of the guardians. Meanwhile, in his Ethics, Aristotle not only defends against Plato a eudaimonist account of the good, but celebrates as an improvement on Socrates the tripartition of the individual soul that creates the basis for the shorter ways analogy between the individual and the city. As delightful as it may well be to debate, as if against Plato, the need for censorship in the ideal city and the famous demand that Homer should be banished, the basis of all such debates is a one-sided view of the Republic, one that follows the lead of Aristotle, whose way of reading it was enshrined in his Politics. In comparison with modernity, which has come to regard Homer as non-existent and denies that the Iliad and the Odyssey were or could ever have been sung by any single poet, it is ironic that Plato gets the credit or opprobrium for, quote, banishing Homer, close quote. The fact that we have come to regard the most poetic of philosophers as opposed to poetry, the philosopher whose surviving writings create a lively portrait of Socrates as being a writer who rejected imitation in principle, and the author of many great speeches, not only by Socrates, but Protagoras, Callicles, and Timaeus as well, as against rhetoric. All of this helps us to understand that the why question is truly inseparable from the how, and that Plato's art of writing transcends the limitations of the written form his Socrates describes in Phaedrus. Amidst many other reasons for reading beyond the surface of the Republic is that a failure to do so has created an image of a Plato who abandoned the political idealism of his middle age in what Aristotle called, quote, the later written laws, close quote. For Aristotle, the tripartite soul of the city-soul analogy marked Plato's progress past the Socratic orientation of his earliest dialogues. As a result, the post-Aristotelian tradition has subjected Plato's writings themselves to a form of tripartition, as early, middle, and late dialogues, instantiated paradigmatically by Protagoras, Republic, and Laws. Considered in the context of great books, Republic belongs to a debate that stretches from Aristotle to Hegel and beyond. Considered in the context of Plato's dialogues as a whole, his Republic is and has been configured as the masterpiece of his middle period, having already begun to outgrow Socrates, but not yet having outgrown his own idealism. Somewhere between these two contexts, the tradition has emphasized two equally unplatonic answers to the question, why read Plato's Republic? It was the overestimation of Plato's Timaeus that would be primarily responsible for the notion that the elderly Plato had abandoned his cave-illustrated idealism, perfectly and paradigmatically illustrated by his characteristic insistence that the true object of philosophy is not of this world. With sublime indifference to the fact that Plato's dialogues contain only the speeches of his characters, it would be Aristotle, whose interest in the physical world is equally characteristic, who penned those fatal words, quote, as Plato says in the Timaeus, close quote, exactly as if the character of Timaeus spoke for Plato in that dialogue. The same kind of interpretive simplicity has subsequently been applied to the Eleatic and Athenian strangers as well, collectively taken as proof that Plato's late dialogues mark a distinct category, far removed from the now outgrown concerns expressed in his early or Socratic dialogues. As already indicated, these hermeneutic preconceptions inevitably color how we read Plato's Republic, and therefore inform any number of answers as to why we should read it. The same kind of hermeneutic simplicity has also been applied to the so-called Socratic dialogues, and Aristotle famously derived his notion of Socrates regarding virtue and knowledge from the claims Plato's Socrates makes in Protagoras. What the tradition that starts from Aristotle is first and foremost neglected is Socrates' use of irony and the delicate position in which his use of it placed those who had the privilege, as Aristotle did not, of being tested by him through dialogue in person. Socratic irony required his interlocutors to see beyond the surface of his apparent meaning to the truths behind that surface. And the two great Socratics who kept him alive through their surviving writings, by which I mean both Plato and Xenophon, needed to find a way to preserve Socratic irony in a literary form. The deliberate use of fallacious arguments by Socrates in Protagoras, no less than the invention of Timaeus and Plato's two strangers, should be regarded collectively, not as changes of mind on Plato's part, but as an ongoing attempt to keep Socrates both beautiful and new, his irony in particular. In conclusion, the reason why we should read Plato's Republic implicates a non-traditional, or rather non-Aristotelian answer as to how we should do so. Rather than embed the brilliant Republic in a series of more or less canonical great books, it should be reconsidered in the context of Plato's dialogues as a whole, no longer read as evidence of Plato's intellectual development, but as the integrated parts of a great pedagogical project, one that would keep Socrates and his rejection of pre-Socratic physics alive. This reconsideration has, for me, taken the form of trying to reconstruct the order in which Plato taught the dialogues, presented as a lively and multifaceted curriculum that asks the student to read Plato's Republic only after being taught how to do so in the series of dialogues that precede it. And that means with care, sensitivity to his use of fallacious arguments, and above all, with a sense of humor, by no means the least important aspect of the Socratic inheritance, and the one that will preserve Socrates' irony into eternity. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and Will. So now we'll begin the debate phase, this area. So if anyone wants to say anything, Fernando y Antonio.
Creo que Juan Diego estaba antes.
Juan Diego está aplaudiendo, creo.
Ah, perdón. De acuerdo, pues en primer lugar, Will, me alegro mucho de verte. ¿Está bien si lo digo en castellano? Porque lo entiendan todos también. Will.
Perdón, la idea, María, si no te he entendido mal, es que hagamos las preguntas en castellano para el seminario y que Rick las traduzca para Will en inglés. ¿Esta sería la idea?
Sí.
Vale,
Muy
lo he
bien.
entendido.
Pues en primer lugar, Will, además de saludarte, muchas gracias por tu charla y muchas gracias por toda la tarea que has hecho con Platón. Estamos disfrutando mucho leyéndola y discutiéndola. Mi pregunta, también sencilla, o empezando por el principio, sería acerca de un aspecto muy general de tu planteamiento, que está incluido en la República cuando asocias la alegoría de la caverna, la imagen de la caverna, con la educación. Y mi pregunta versa acerca de la perspectiva de Platón como maestro, ¿no? Plato as a teacher. Mi pregunta, para empezar, sería, ¿habría alguna diferencia en la obra de Platón entre el filósofo, la figura del filósofo y la figura del maestro? Podría estar también, o una pregunta paralela o complementaria a esta sería la de si hay alguna diferencia o qué es lo que diferencia lo que la filosofía o el filósofo dicen de lo que diría el profesor de cualquier otra cosa. Es decir, cualquier otra materia. Si habría una diferencia cualitativa. Muchas gracias. Estas serían las primeras preguntas.
So, Ricardo, I take it that I need to explain how I understand the relationship between being a philosopher and being a teacher. Is that right?
Yes,
Not absolutely. I mean, if there is some difference between the teacher and the philosopher. I mean, if Plato is more a philosopher, a teacher, or being a philosopher and teacher are the same thing.
I see. Yeah. Okay, well, it's very clear that that Plato situates his dialogues not only around the character of Socrates, but around the character of Socrates in distinction to the sophists. Now, the sophists are wise men that are clearly teachers, and they were great and influential teachers. And the relationship between Socrates and the sophists is just as important in answering your question as the relationship between a teacher in the abstract and a philosopher in the abstract, is that a mode of teaching needed to be created that would counteract the kind of teaching that the sophists were doing. the sophists were charging money for their teaching. They were teaching a kind of immorality that Plato despised and that Socrates challenged as well, and that they had to be that an alternative that did not use the sophists' methods needed to be found. And I think that the answer to that, your question, very nice question that follows directly, I think, from what I said in my talk to you this afternoon, is that it was that the relationship is between a kind of ironic form of teaching used by Socrates and philosophy. In other words, that the sophists, obviously, the name suggests that they are wise and can make others wise, or at least sophisticated. The notion of philosophy is more humble and possibly more ironic than that. So when Socrates says that he doesn't know anything, we can all see that he knows a great many things, and that his irony shines through. He doesn't claim to be a teacher. He doesn't claim to be able to teach virtue. So I guess that's what I would say. You know, when the essential question of Protagoras, which is, I think you all know, I regard as the kind of introductory dialogue to the dialogues as a whole, begins with Socrates making an argument, or an ongoing argument, to the effect that virtue cannot be taught. Whereas, in fact, it seems to me that in the Republic, Plato finally teaches what virtue is. Virtue is not worrying about what's good for me, but worrying about what's good, like preferring ta kalon to what is in my self-interest, what I call the de-datived, transcending the dative of self-interest. That kind of irony, by teaching virtue by an explicit claim that virtue cannot be taught, by making eloquent speeches against rhetoric, by creating a cosmology that is deliberately filled with many self-contradictions and flaws, that the philosophy that Socrates had transmitted to Plato became inseparable from a kind of irony that clearly distinguished them from the known teachers of the day. So if we look at the known teachers of the day, the sophists as lecturers who pretend to know everything that you need to know, and then we compare that with Socratic questioning of eliciting from the student or interlocutor their views, and then testing them, refuting them, challenging them, making outrageous claims in response to them, that we get a form of teaching that was distinguished from that of the sophists. Now, your question, really, I haven't answered it because you're asking a much more interesting question than the historical one. You're asking, what is the relationship between being a teacher and being a philosopher? And I guess that I would just say that as far as I'm concerned, that the true philosopher is inevitably a teacher, that you can't help but be a teacher as well. Now, this doesn't mean to say that there aren't many philosophers, so-called philosophers and actual philosophers, that didn't enjoy teaching, weren't good at teaching, didn't put effort into teaching. And it seems to me that if you're concerned as a Socratic with the way of life, and you fully believe that the unexamined life is not worth living, either for you or for anybody else that you meet, that you have an obligation to point out that to all that you meet, that there's certain unexamined presuppositions that you are acting as if you knew that you don't know, and that it would be better for you to give some thought to the things that you don't know. As Henry David Thoreau wrote in Walden, how can a man remember well his ignorance, which his growth requires, who has so often to use his knowledge? what I take that to mean is that Socrates has no choice but to be a gadfly, that the philosopher must necessarily engage all and sundry, whether in the agora or in the assembly or in the jail cell, with the kind of questions that benefit them and help them to lead a more examined life. But thanks for the question. It's a nice one.
Bien, una respuesta breve, fácil de resumir y de traducir.
Oh, shit.
Vamos allá. Sin problemas. Como primera ha estado muy divertida. Vale, creo que más o menos todo el mundo lo ha entendido. No es necesaria mi traducción, pero podríamos decir que... Vale.
Yo creo que puedo resumirla si no, si quieres, Rick.
No, hombre, no, si no me quitarías la alegría de vivir en este momento, después de estos momentos de gran emoción, como dirían los que cantaban en la mandrágora. Básicamente, lo que el profesor Altman estaba comentando era que en realidad había que poner en contraste las formas de los sofistas y la forma de Sócrates. Los sofistas se presentaban como grandes profesores que cobraban, que sabían enseñar lo que era la virtud, y frente a eso Sócrates mostraba una humildad absoluta, diciendo que muchas veces la virtud no se podía enseñar, pero que a través de la ironía y de esa humildad podía, no obstante, llegar a expresar lo que en realidad al principio en el Protágoras, William Altman lo pone como un diálogo introductorio a todo el corpus platónico, acababa en esa especie de expresión contradictoria que no acababa de llegar a ningún sitio, pero finalmente en la República permitía llegar a la gran respuesta. Si quieres saber lo que es el bien, no preguntes lo que es bueno para ti, sino pregunta lo que es bueno en absoluto. Y precisamente intentando mostrar que esa virtud en ocasiones no puede ser enseñada, pero que hay un camino que hay que recorrer para llegar hasta ello, hasta lograr encontrar lo que el bien es en sí mismo, mostraba que aplicando esa ironía, ¿cómo diríamos? Se separaba de los sofistas y se convertía en lo que podíamos llamar un profesor, alguien que escuchaba, que respondía, que retaba a sus alumnos, incluso con algunos argumentos falaces, pero que hacía llegar a los alumnos a esa pregunta y poco a poco a la propia respuesta de qué es el bien en sí mismo. El profesor Altman también asume que no todo profesor efectivamente es un filósofo, pero que los filósofos básicamente deben ser profesores. Y que aunque, si bien es cierto que algunos filósofos, o así llamados filósofos, no disfrutan con la enseñanza, no practican la enseñanza, no son profesores, inevitablemente sí es cierto que una vida que merece ser, una vida que merece ser vivida es aquella que debe ser examinada, por tanto, ninguna vida que no se examina merece ser vivida. Asumimos que un filósofo debe no solamente examinar, preguntarse, asumir esas grandes preguntas, sino también llevar las preguntas al ágora, llevar las preguntas a los demás, de algún modo convertirse en un profesor que aproxime la labor de la pregunta y, por tanto, de la búsqueda de la respuesta a todo el mundo. El profesor Altman ha hecho una referencia a una cita de Thoreau, pero desafortunadamente ha sido demasiado para mí.
La cita
está en economía, ¿no?
Está al principio del libro y dice algo así, que cómo vamos a recordar nuestra ignorancia si tenemos que estar ejerciendo tantas veces o de una manera tan continua nuestro conocimiento.
Exacto.
Esa es la cita de Walden.
Te toca
No sé,
sí.
Ricardo, en aras de una comunicación eficaz, yo voy a hacer 3 planteamientos y me gustaría que se los tradujeras uno por uno al profesor Altman. Tu inglés es mucho mejor que el mío. Lo primero es un comentario a lo que ha dicho Fernando y a lo que ha contestado Will. Y es que no diremos nunca de una manera suficiente que un filósofo que no sea profesor plantea serias dudas. Dentro de apenas 2 semanas vamos a tener un seminario, a mi modo de ver, muy importante sobre la enseñanza de la filosofía, que creo que debe recordarnos a todos este planteamiento que Will acaba de hacer. en estos momentos en España, pero yo creo que en estos momentos, en la situación en la que vive la humanidad, el filósofo tiene un único compromiso, que es el de bajar a la caverna. El que no haya entendido esto, creo que debe volver a las aulas, pero en condición de alumno. Este sería el primer planteamiento. El
Ok,
segundo es...
lo voy
Espera.
traduciendo.
sí, por favor, porque no es una
Siguiendo
pregunta.
sus
Exactamente.
instrucciones. Okay, so Professor Altman, Antonio is going to make three comments. Well, he's going to present three thoughts. The first of which is that he believes that any philosopher who is not a teacher, well, presents a real problem. It's something odd about him or about her. In fact, we are having a seminar in the next week about this difficult thing of teaching and learning philosophy. So Antonio says that nowadays the philosopher has one and only one big task to accomplish, which is go down into the cavern. So this is the first one. The second continues.
La segunda es prácticamente de la misma importancia. Yo creo que los seminarios sobre Platón, que siguiendo el orden de lectura de William Altman estáis, puesto que es una cuestión que lleváis prácticamente los más jóvenes de la torre, es probablemente lo más importante que la torre del Virrey ha hecho en los 17 o 18 años que llevamos de experiencia. ¿Por qué? Fijaos, el último libro que se ha publicado sobre Platón, en el año 2023, apenas hace nada, de Robin Waterfield, que menciona a William Altman en los reconocimientos, puesto que Will le ha enviado su libro sobre la academia. Es un libro absolutamente decepcionante. Para alguien que conoce a la perfección la literatura y la filosofía antiguas, vuelve a los viejos clichés. Es desconcertante. Mucho de lo que estamos haciendo de la mano de Will está a una altura muy superior a lo que ese libro de uno de los grandes filólogos contemporáneos ha puesto en relieve. ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Que, en cierto modo, esta insistencia, que me alegra mucho que Will haya hecho, de no ser tradicionales, es decir, de no ser aristotélicos, hemos de tomárnosla muy en serio. Y es algo que le agradezco esta tarde profundamente a Will. Esta ecuación, que a partir de ahora me permito usar con mucha frecuencia, no tradicional, no aristotélico, como una especie de pauta para volver a leer algunas cosas. Rick, please.
The second vision that Antonio wants to share with you is that the seminar that La Torre is holding about the dialogues following your proposal order of lecture, of reading, of the dialogues, is probably the most important thing that La Torre has done in the last 18 years. And especially because Antonio points that there has been a very recent publication about Plato by Professor Waterfield, who mentions you in the book. But Antonio says that this publishing of 2022 is very deceiving because Professor Waterfield goes back to the old cliches about Plato. And so Antonio believes that what we are doing hand in hand with you, following your prompt, is much better than anything that has been written in the last years about Plato. And basically, he points in this second moment that what you said about not being traditional, not being Aristotelian in the way in which we approach Plato is one of the most important things that he has seen in the last times regarding the reading of Plato, and that he intends to follow this and use this prompt from now on. And the third one is about to come.
La tercera, para que no parezca esto un intercambio de benevolencias, la tercera es una cuestión suscitada por la edición del profesor Dodds del Gorgias de Platón. A propósito de Calicles, el profesor Dodds plantea un problema muy serio. Lo que William Altman ha planteado, en general en la pentalogía sobre Platón y esta tarde en el apretado resumen que ha hecho del orden de lectura y de lo que realmente nos está preocupando a todos, la mayor parte de nosotros tiene algo que ver con la filosofía o la enseñanza de la filosofía, es hasta qué punto este idealismo de Platón pueda esconder algo completamente distinto. En este caso lo llamaríamos la tentación de Calícles. Voy a leerlo, voy a traducirlo al español, Rick, y si quieres después lo leo en inglés para que entienda la pregunta. La pregunta es si él cree que efectivamente Platón se ha constituido a sí mismo negando el Calícles que llevaba dentro.
Ok, antes de que lo leas, si te parece, le planteo la pregunta y así puedes estar atento. So the number 3, Professor Altman, is, well, after praising your good work, here comes the big question, the challenging one. Professor Lastra says that in the latter edition of Professor Dodds about the Gorgias, there's what he calls the trouble with the problem with Callicles. You, Professor Altman, say that well, behind the idealism of Plato is something hiding. There's something else beyond this idealism of Plato. And so now Professor Lastra is going to read an excerpt of this work by Dodds, after which he's going to present with the question. Antonio, cuando quieras.
Page 14. One is tempted to believe that Callicles stands for something which Plato had it in him to become, would perhaps have become but for Socrates, and unrealized Plato, who lies deeply buried beneath the foundations of the Republic. And now my question is Callicles in the foundations of the Republic? Thank you very much, Will.
La pregunta para el resto, para los que escuchan en español, la pregunta de Antonio sería si Callicles está oculto en los fundamentos de la República.
Gee. Let's see.
Ostras.
3 questions. Well, let me start then with the first. The 5th book of Plato's Republic ends with discussion of the so-called third wave of paradox. Oh, by the way, and this time, Ricardo, I'm just going to go in short bits and let you translate. I completely forgot to do that before. I'm sorry.
God bless
So,
you.
yeah, well, why don't we start with that?
Sí. Muy bien, trocitos cortitos para favorecer un poquito el sistema. El profesor Altman comenta que el 5º libro de la República acaba con la discusión sobre la llamada tercera forma de la paradoja.
But the most paradoxical element of the third wave of paradox has not been discussed.
Pero la forma más paradójica, lo más paradójico de esa tercera forma de la paradoja todavía no se ha discutido.
It is one thing to say that we will never have well-run cities until kings become philosophers or philosophers become kings.
Una cosa es decir que no tendremos ciudades bien gobernadas hasta que los filósofos se conviertan en reyes o los reyes en filósofos.
But the truly paradoxical element is what he says after that.
Pero el auténtico elemento paradójico aparece después de decir eso.
Which is that the mass of those who do one without the other, who are philosophers without being political, or who are politicians without being philosophers, all of those people have to be excluded.
Y es que la gran masa de aquellos que hacen una cosa sin la otra, es decir, los filósofos que no son políticos y los políticos que no son filósofos deben ser excluidos.
Now, it's quite obvious that it would be better for the world if all of the rulers were philosophers.
Evidentemente sería mejor para el mundo si todos los gobernantes fueran filósofos.
But the most paradoxical element of the third wave of paradox is that Plato is saying that philosophers who are not political need to be excluded.
Pero lo más paradójico de esta tercera forma o tercera ola de la paradoja es cuando Platón dice que aquellos filósofos que no quieren ser políticos deben ser excluidos.
And I take that to be Plato's answer to Antonio's excellent first question.
Y creo que esa es la respuesta para la excelente primera pregunta de Antonio.
Without involvement in the affairs of your city,
Sin tomar parte en los asuntos de tu ciudad,
without concern for your fellow citizens and the responsibilities of citizenship,
sin preocuparte por tus compañeros, compañeros ciudadanos y por los asuntos de la ciudad,
you might as well be a worm.
bien podría ser un gusano.
Okay. So that's number one. Number two, that he said a lot of nice things about me. I wish I deserved them. More and more, as you could hear in the paper that I gave today, is that my work on Plato presupposes a great difference between Plato and Aristotle.
Lo primero que dice es que ojalá fuera merecedor, falsa modestia por otra parte, hago aquí la pequeña morcilla, de las alabanzas que Antonio está haciendo sobre su trabajo. Y dice que, como podemos haber visto en la conferencia que nos ha dado hace un momento, mucha parte de su trabajo, buena parte de su trabajo está en diferenciar la doctrina de Platón de la de Aristóteles.
So there is a great tradition that is perhaps best exemplified by Plotinus, but is very common to say that there is a harmonization or a sympathia or a combination or an agreement between Plato and Aristotle.
Hay una gran tradición que indica que hay una gran armonía entre el pensamiento de los dos, entre Platón y Aristóteles.
Now, since Maria was kind enough to emphasize that one of the ideas that she likes in my work is my use of the division sign to illustrate Platonism.
Y como María ha sido tan amable de comentar, una de las cosas que más le gustan del trabajo del profesor Altman es su división dentro del platonismo.
It is precisely that division sign that makes Plato and Aristotle incompatible.
Bueno, bien está decir que ese signo de división es lo que hace a Platón y Aristóteles incompatibles.
But quite apart from any differences I might have with Neoplatonism and Plotinus,
pero aunque tenga muchas diferencias o muchos desacuerdos con el neoplatonismo y Plotino,
most every professor of ancient philosophy needs to be equally skilled in discussing Plato and Aristotle.
Cualquier profesor de filosofía antigua tiene que ser igualmente hábil tanto en la discusión de Platón como en la de Aristóteles.
And I have come increasingly to believe that explicating both well is impossible for the same person to do.
Y ha llegado a la conclusión de que explicar a los dos bien, a Platón y Aristóteles, es imposible para la misma persona.
And that what I have been increasingly impressed by is how strongly Aristotle has influenced the way people read Plato.
Y lo que más le ha impresionado es la forma en la que Aristóteles ha influenciado el modo en el que la gente lee a Platón.
And so I'll get back to on Antonio's first question, is that what we are generally told is that since Aristotle knew Plato and spent many years at the academy, what he says about Plato must be accurate.
Y volviendo un poco a la primera pregunta de Antonio, solemos asumir que como Aristóteles estuvo mucho tiempo en la academia y conoció a Platón, lo que diga sobre Platón debe estar bien.
To which I have two responses.
Para lo que el profesor Altman tiene dos respuestas.
Number one, it's very obvious that Aristotle did not agree with Plato on the very most important matters, above all, what we call the separation of the forms.
La primera es que evidentemente Aristóteles no estaba de acuerdo en muchísimas cosas con Platón. Una de ellas, una quizá de las más importantes, la separación de las formas, del mundo de las ideas.
And the second is that Aristotle's decision to stay on at the academy doesn't necessarily indicate that he understood Plato very well either.
Y segundo, que la decisión de Aristóteles de permanecer en la academia no indica que necesariamente él entendiera bien a Platón.
And I think that I would modify or clarify my answer to Antonio's first question.
Y para clarificar un poco más la respuesta a la primera pregunta de Antonio,
is that while Aristotle stayed on at the academy and then went on to Macedon clearly as a teacher,
es que cuando, o sea, una forma de volver a esa primera pregunta es señalar que cuando Aristóteles permaneció en la academia y fue a Macedonia, obviamente,
it was not kind of teaching that I believe that Plato it points to in the third wave of paradox.
No era precisamente la forma de enseñar, no era el tipo de profesor al que Platón se estaba refiriendo en la tercera forma de la paradoja.
If the extent of your teaching of philosophy is to justify the status quo and the powers that be,
si tu forma de enseñar es justificar el status quo y los poderes fácticos del momento,
it doesn't matter if you're a brilliant teacher at the University of Berlin lecturing on the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history.
No importa si eres un brillante profesor en la Universidad de Berlín enseñando sobre historia de la filosofía y filosofía de la historia.
So it's not simply being a teacher that marks the philosopher.
Por tanto, no es solamente ser un profesor lo que marca a un filósofo, lo que hace a alguien un filósofo,
but someone that recognizes the inadequacy of the worldly arrangements exemplified by the powers that be and takes a stand against them.
sino ser capaz de darse cuenta de los arreglos equivocados que el mundo a su alrededor está haciendo, señalarlos y oponerse a ellos.
And maybe that could bring us to the Callicles question.
Y quizás esto nos lleva a la pregunta sobre Callicles.
I was looking in my book because there's a great footnote in Dodds's commentary on the Gorgias where he revisits his idea of the buried side of Plato.
Estaba echando un vistazo al libro porque hay una nota a pie de página en el libro de Dodds sobre Gorgias, una bastante extensa, que hace referencia a ello.
And in this footnote, he shows the parallels between Callicles and the Eleatic and Athenian strangers.
Y en esa nota a pie de página hace un paralelismo entre Callicles y los extranjeros eleatas y atenienses.
Let me see. My claim, as Antonio well knows, is that that Dodds on page 14 in the passage that Antonio read is correct. In other words, that Callicles is who Plato would have been had he not been Socratized.
Señala que, como bien sabe Antonio, su opinión es que Dodd en la página 14 tiene razón. Es decir, que Platón hubiera sido Callicles de no haber sido socratizado.
Exactly. Now, and this, to begin with, this implicates Antonio's first question, which is Socrates met a young man who we could call Callicles, but really was Aristocles, a brilliant young man from a very famous family, the great-grandson of Solon the Wise, and took the time to refute him.
Y volvemos a la primera pregunta porque nos encontramos con Sócrates, el profesor que toma bajo su enseñanza, es decir, decide ser el profesor de un joven Calícles, al que podríamos llamar Aristócles, ese perteneciente a una familia rica, descendiente de Solón, y le enseña, se convierte en su profesor.
I thought you might have said Aristoteles and not Aristocles, but it doesn't matter. In other words, that Socratic education sought out smart, young, immoral, gifted Athenians and tried to change them.
No sé si he dicho Aristóteles o Aristóteles, pero en cualquier caso, el profesor Altman estaría de acuerdo en los dos casos. Lo que buscaba la educación de Sócrates era buscar jóvenes ricos, inmorales, atenienses, y intentar educarlos, sacarles de ese lugar en el que estaban y hacerlos mejores.
And then the second thing is that Dodds, I believe, believes that the Callicles, the hidden Callicles in Plato is the real Plato.
Y por tanto cree que Dodds considera que el Calícles oculto es Platón.
And that's very similar to Leo Strauss, who believes that the Athenian stranger who escapes from Athens is the real Socrates.
Y es muy parecido a lo que Leo Strauss considera al creer que el extranjero ateniense que escapa es el auténtico Sócrates.
Whereas my approach is to see in Socratic education a conversion.
Mientras que su visión es ver en la educación de Sócrates una conversión.
A realization of sin.
Un darse cuenta del pecado, sí.
A confession, a repentance, and a conversion.
Un arrepentimiento sobre ese pecado y finalmente una conversión.
And my use of Christian language here is deliberate.
Y el uso de lenguaje cristiano aquí es deliberado.
And I will defend it not because Socratic conversion was Christian.
Y no lo va a defender porque la conversión socrática sea cristiana.
But because it was more difficult than Christian conversion.
Sino porque era aún más difícil que la conversión cristiana.
For all of us, if we decided to convert to the faith of our ancestors, our grandmothers and our cousins and a long body of people on the street would celebrate us. They would think that was great, that some youth that had been studying philosophy had suddenly found the faith of their fathers.
Para todos nosotros, si nos convirtiéramos a la fe de nuestros padres, sería para gran regocijo de la gente que nos rodea, de nuestra familia, de la gente por la calle.
There was no such support for Socratic conversion.
Pero no había ese apoyo para una conversión socrática.
Nobody thought being humble was good.
Nadie pensaba que ser humilde fuera bueno.
Megalopsukia was a virtue.
Sorry.
Megalopsukia, great souledness, was a virtue.
Megalopsukia era una virtud.
Revived by Aristotle. It was a culture-wide virtue to think highly of yourself because you were great.
Lo retomó así Aristóteles. Era una parte de la cultura considerar que una gran virtud era pensar mucho sobre uno mismo.
And no mistake, both Plato and Xenophon, by the standards of their culture, were great.
Y desde luego podemos ver que ni Platón ni Jenofonte, para los estándares de su cultura, eran grandes, no seguían esa tradición.
They were smart. They were capable, brilliant men.
Eran altos, ricos, guapos, sabían montar a caballo, sabían luchar en la palestra, eran una maravilla.
And Socrates reduced them down to the level of a slave by pointing out how ignorant, how foolish, how self-contradictory their thinking was.
Y Sócrates los redujo al estado de un esclavo al señalar lo como de contradictorios, de ignorantes y de idiotas, básicamente eran al tener esa visión de sí mismos.
And there was no pleasant coming home in that conversion.
Y no había una agradable vuelta a casa, ese reconocimiento de tus seres queridos en esa conversión.
It was lonely and frightening.
Llevaba a la soledad y al miedo.
So the converted Xenophon and the converted Plato, they remembered what it had been like to be Callicles, and they had remembered what it was like to admire Cyrus the Great, but they were different. And I will conclude by using the words of Shakespeare. One of his characters says, "I do not blush to tell you the thing I was, since my conversion so sweetly tastes being the thing I am."
Y empezaré con la cita magnífica de Shakespeare antes de que se me vaya a la cabeza, citando a Shakespeare diciendo que no me duelen prendas en confesar lo que fui, puesto que mi conversión ha sido tan completa y tan absoluta. Básicamente dice que tanto Jenofonte como Platón recordaban lo que habían sido, recordaban aquello que fueron, aquellos jóvenes engreídos, ricos, altos, guapos y estupendos, aquellos que admiraban a Ciro el Grande, pero que evidentemente no tenían ningún problema en recordar aquello que fueron porque ahora eran una cosa diferente. La conversión del profesor Sócrates sobre ellos había tenido el éxito que prometía.
Perfecto.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Altman. I'm
Hello.
loving your discussion. Y me gustaría seguir en inglés, pero para que sea más rápido lo hago en español. Siguiendo la línea de la psicología de los filósofos, que es más historia que filosofía, me ha recordado lo que has dicho a uno de los pensamientos de Pascal, que, bueno, ¿tenéis que traducirlo o no?
Como tú quieras, sí. Si me queréis ir dando pie, como el profesor, me vas haciendo
Sí.
pausas y yo voy tirando.
Mejor. Pues es este pensamiento que dice que Platón y Aristóteles en verdad cumplían el papel, el rol, como si fuese el teatro, de en serios a sí mismos y a la vida, porque sabían que las personas que los rodeaban a ellos en verdad estaban locos, madmen, y, y que precisamente para que no se perdieran, ¿no?, en la vida, para que no fueran, no tuvieran más vicios, Platón y Aristóteles decidieron tomarse la vida en serio y debemos objetivarla. Eso es un pensamiento de Pascal que aparece en su libro. Y efectivamente yo creo que se puede interpretar. Te dejo. Sí, sí.
Voy a darle la primera dosis. So the question starts pointing that what you have been saying reminds our friend here to a thought of Pascal that says that Plato and Aristotle took themselves very seriously because they thought that everybody surrounding them were crazy people. So they thought that in order for them, for the other people not to get astray, not to get lost, they should take themselves very seriously so they could represent this role, this kind of theatrical role of seriousness about their thoughts. And continue saying that.
Y eso, vale. También me ha recordado eso a la visión de la filosofía que tiene Ortega y Gasset, en la que es bien un juego entre intelectuales que más que pseudo monjes que aspiran a un tipo de razón universal objetiva. Entonces, yo creo que efectivamente se puede aplicar la misma interpretación a lo que es la filosofía de Platón, para darnos cuenta de que su método bueno, que toma de Sócrates, ¿no? La ironía tenía, era menos serio de lo que parecía y que no era, digamos, no, sencillamente eso, que su rol de profesor eh, debe tomarse, digamos, más a la ligera precisamente por esa ironía autoconsciente que envuelve toda su figura. No sé si se ha entendido, pero tú díselo que seguro que responde a algo.
Okay, allá voy. And he continues saying that it reminds him also to the work of Ortega Gasset, this Spanish philosopher, who says that this philosophy is like a game of intellectuals trying to be something like pseudo monks, trying to find an objective truth. And therefore, contrasting it with Plato's method, this method based on irony, makes him believe that maybe Plato seems more serious than it should present itself to us. That maybe Plato was not so serious as he pretends to be. Vamos a ver qué tal.
Well, those are all very interesting thoughts. I'm not exactly sure how to respond to them. I guess I would just respond by saying, yeah, that sounds, I agree. That sounds good to me. I think that that by writing in dialogues and by writing in dialogues for young people. So you just start with that, by writing in dialogues and writing in dialogues for young people.
Ok, está comentando que, bueno, en principio no sabría muy bien cómo responder, pero lo primero que me viene a la cabeza es pensar que sí, probablemente tenga razón y que precisamente el hecho de que Platón escriba diálogos y diálogos para gente joven.
And by writing with a great sense of humor.
Y escribiendo con un gran sentido del humor.
And by writing in a way that preserves Socratic irony.
Y en una forma en la que se preserva la ironía socrática.
Naturally, Plato was less serious than the stereotypical image of the serious philosopher would take him and has always taken him.
Evidentemente, Platón era menos serio que esa visión estereotípica del filósofo serio que se toma tan en serio a sí mismo.
On the other hand, I think Aristotle took himself extremely seriously.
Por otra parte, cree que Aristóteles se tomó quizá demasiado en serio a sí mismo.
So if I had any quarrel with my friend Pascal,
así que si tuviera alguna discusión con su amigo Pascal,
it would be the traditional quarrel I have with everybody that puts Plato and Aristotle in the same basket.
Sería la misma discusión que he tenido con todo el mundo que pone a Platón y Aristóteles en el mismo cesto.
As far as Ortega goes, I would have to read that particular passage to respond intelligently.
En cuanto a Ortega, tendría que leer ese pasaje en particular para poder responder con cierta profundidad.
But insofar as his point has been encapsulated as that perhaps Plato didn't take himself as seriously as he appears to, I agree.
Pero en tanto que parece que su pensamiento está encapsulado en esa expresión de que Platón no se tomaba demasiado en serio a sí mismo, el profesor Altman está de acuerdo.
Gracias.
Nada.
Creo que me toca a mí, pero si quiere Eric plantear la pregunta primero, porque yo ya he hecho una.
Como quieras, Fernando.
Quieras. Bueno, yo quería hacer una pregunta que siento si es demasiado general, pero es que creo que la mayoría de los presentes nos la hemos hecho alguna vez o nos la hacemos continuamente. Y es, ¿cómo y cuándo sabe un filósofo que ha llegado el momento de bajar de nuevo? Esto, que es lo mismo que preguntar cómo sabe un filósofo que es filósofo realmente.
The question is very short and very good, and Eric says that maybe it's a very general question, but he believes that everybody has made himself, herself, the same question. How and when does a philosopher know that is the time to go down, to go back to the cavern? In other words, how and when does a philosopher know that he or she is indeed a philosopher?
Well, one is tempted to answer in alignment with Antonio's first question.
Uno tiene la tentación de responder alineándose con la primera pregunta de Antonio.
And that is that when you have something to teach,
Y
then you go down.
es que cuando tengas algo que enseñar, entonces tienes que regresar.
Let me see if I can give you an example.
Veamos si puede poner un ejemplo.
Most people on the planet profess a desire to be rich.
Casi todo el mundo en el planeta profesa el deseo de ser rico.
What if you were to discover with blinding certainty that a rich person could never be happy?
Y si llegaras a descubrir con total certeza que una persona rica jamás llegaría a ser feliz.
Because happiness cannot exist without true friendship.
Porque la amistad no puede existir sin auténtica amistad.
True friendship is not based on desire to acquire your friend's money.
La auténtica amistad no está basada en el deseo de quedarse con el dinero de tus amigos.
But a rich person can never be sure that their friends don't really want their money.
Pero un hombre rico nunca está seguro de que sus amigos no quieran su dinero.
And they find themselves forced to test all of their friends.
Y por tanto se ven obligados los ricos a poner a prueba a todos sus amigos
To see if they are true friends.
para ver si son amigos de verdad.
And in the process, lose both true and false friends.
Y en el proceso pierden tanto a los falsos como a los verdaderos amigos.
If one had such a thought, one would be compelled to share it.
Si uno tuviera ese pensamiento, esa certeza, se vería obligado, forzado a compartirla.
Because they would be testifying against a truth that they would be testifying against a view that the world thinks is true, that is really false.
Porque estarían testificando, estarían dando testimonio de que aquello que el mundo cree que es verdadero en realidad es falso.
So I guess I would say to my friend that when you arrive at a point of view where you can see that many of the things that you thought were true are false, and that many of the things that people continue to believe are true are really false, then you have left the cave.
Por tanto, respondería diciendo que cuando llegas al momento en el que te das cuenta de que muchas cosas que pensabas ciertas son falsas, y cuando llegas al momento en que te das cuenta de que muchas de las cosas que la gente piensa que son ciertas son falsas, ya estás fuera de la caverna.
Or at the very least, you have reached a point where returning from where you have been begins to make sense.
O al menos has alcanzado el punto en el que volver a donde has estado empieza a tener sentido.
That's what I've got on that one.
Y esto es lo que tiene que decir.
Muchas gracias.
Fernando, creo que Adolfo también tenía la mano levantada. Si quieres hacer el mismo gesto.
Lo que diga Adolfo.
Yo prefiero que la hagas tú antes porque a lo mejor nuestras preguntas se solapan, es bastante probable. Entonces, continúa la tuya y si yo tengo algo que añadir, lo añado.
¿Seguro? Vale. Will, mi pregunta gira o versa sobre el mismo problema que creo que es el centro de tu propuesta, la identificación del filósofo con el profesor o con el maestro, ¿no? Con el teacher. Y mi pregunta en relación con el pasaje que has citado antes es la siguiente. Si Sócrates mismo dice que que se puede ser filósofo sin ser político, aunque ese filósofo merezca ser excluido, el asunto es, cuando el filósofo efectivamente es filósofo y político, baja como profesor, pero ahí está siendo filósofo y político, no está siendo solo filósofo. Es decir, no es el profesor o el maestro filósofo y político. Por otro lado, si Platón no ha sido excluido, como dice Sócrates, y efectivamente vuelve a bajar a la caverna, que puede ser en este caso la escritura, y ha escrito un libro que representa una enseñanza, es decir, está siendo profesor, quizá eso Sócrates también lo está diciendo en nombre de la filosofía y de la política. Mi principal problema al respecto es pensar que si identificamos a el profesor o al maestro solo con el filósofo y no con el filósofo y político, el filósofo que también tiene una parte de política, mi principal problema es que al identificar al profesor simplemente con el filósofo nos volvamos sofistas, porque no reconozcamos la parte de política, la parte de ensuciarnos las manos, la parte de compromiso, ideología, lo que queramos llamar, que tiene el profesor. Es decir, creo que tengo que ser consciente como profesor, principalmente porque creo ser o soy un profesor de filosofía, que hay una parte de mí que no es filósofo y que si la confundo quizás esté haciendo un flaco favor tanto a la filosofía o a la representación de la filosofía como a mis alumnos. Gracias, era esto.
No, no me digas que ahora no la vas a traducir tú también.
Vale, si queréis, sí. Will, I want to ask you if Socrates separates the figure of the poet, of the philosopher, of the figure of the, I mean, if Socrates says that one could be a philosopher without coming back to when going down to the city, and to going down to the city and to go down to the city, one needs to be or has to be philosopher and politician. The teacher is philosopher and politician, not only philosopher. And I think that maybe or could be dangerous, identify or think that the teacher is only a philosopher because doesn't recognize the part of politician, the dirty part that he has in the going down to the cave.
Well, first of all, I don't know that I'm completely satisfied with my answer to Eric's question, so I want to kind of revisit that in the context of your question.
Lo primero que quería comentar es que no está seguro de estar del todo satisfecho con la respuesta que he dado a Eric, por tanto, le interesaría revisitar esa respuesta en el contexto de tu pregunta.
First of all, I need to make clear that I have very little to say about Socrates. What I always talk about is Plato's Socrates.
Lo primero es que tiene muy poco que decir sobre Sócrates. Él siempre habla del Sócrates de Platón.
I didn't want to bypass that. Now, to situate my answer to your question in the context of Eric's question, is the big problem, it seems to me, in interpreting Plato is that one style of reading Plato presents him as completely spiritual, as otherworldly, as exclusively on the upper side of the division sign that Maria talked about earlier.
Para responder a tu pregunta y volver también sobre la de Eric, le interesaría comentar que una de las visiones que se tienen de Platón es como algo que es como divino, como fuera de este mundo, en la parte superior de esa división a la que hacía referencia María antes.
On the other hand, that there's a view of Plato where he's much more down to earth, where his dialogues are always embodied in specific people, where he's involved in the affairs of the city, where he's skeptical, and where he's a much more down-to-earth individual, especially Socrates in the dialogues.
Y por otro lado hay una visión de Platón mucho más terrenal, mucho más cercana a aquí abajo, con sus diálogos encarnando o encarnados en personajes particulares, con comentarios más escépticos, es decir, una visión, como digo, más en el lado inferior de esa división.
And the resolution of this dilemma is that Plato Socrates is both, and that Platonism is both. There's an up and a down.
Y la resolución de este dilema es que el Sócrates de Platón es ambas cosas, que el platonismo es ambas cosas. Hay una arriba y hay una abajo.
Now, in my answer to Eric, I didn't give adequate attention to what the up really means.
En su respuesta, Eric no había prestado suficiente atención en lo que arriba significa.
I took what might be called a via negativa to what is up.
Había tomado lo que podríamos llamar una vía negativa, lo que es arriba.
It's what the world does not think.
Es lo que el mundo no piensa.
Eric must realize that there is more to it than that.
Eric debe darse cuenta de que hay más que eso sobre ese
There's
tema.
a higher reality that the philosopher accesses or reaches
Hay una realidad más alta a la que accede el filósofo,
that is not just what the world doesn't think,
que no es solo lo que el mundo no cree,
but which is a bright light of goodness that is not of this world.
sino que es una luz brillante del bien, o es la brillante luz del bien que no pertenece a este mundo.
And so I needed to clarify that to this fine young man.
Y quería clarificar esto a este muchacho tan agradable.
Now back to the basic question about I think that's what I've been saying all along, is that I think it's Plato's considered view that the philosopher who doesn't attend, who doesn't go back down, and who isn't also a politician is not a true philosopher. And I think the only thing that I would add is that Plato is not what can I say? That in thinking about Plato, it is not only important to realize that he wrote books, but the kind of books that he wrote and the purpose of the books that he wrote. Most philosophers, I think, write books that express what they think is true.
Hago aquí una pequeña pausa, if you allow me. Principalmente para responderte, Fernando vuelve a su afirmación inicial, que el filósofo es auténticamente filósofo cuando se envuelve en política. Un filósofo que no quiere envolverse en política no es filósofo. Para ello hay que tener en cuenta no solamente que Platón escribiera libros, sino qué tipo de libros escribía. Hay filósofos que escriben libros sobre aquello de lo que están seguros.
I think what makes Plato completely unique as a writer of philosophy is that the way he wrote philosophy is absolutely inseparable from his being a teacher.
Y cree que lo que hace a Platón totalmente único es que su forma de escribir era totalmente indistinguible, estaba totalmente relacionada con su forma de ser un profesor.
The idea behind Plato, the teacher, is that Plato's dialogues are the curriculum of Plato's academy.
La idea detrás del libro del profesor Altman, Platón, el profesor, es la idea de que los diálogos son el currículum de la academia platónica.
They're not works like the works of Aristotle or Hegel or Kant. They are designed to be applied down in the cave to students
No son, bueno, era Platón el maestro, no el profesor, la traducción de María Golfe. No son obras como la de Hegel o la de cualquier otro filósofo al que estamos acostumbrados, sino que son obras que están diseñadas para ser aplicadas en la caverna, para ser aplicadas en la escuela.
So if Plato's dialogues are filled with politics.
Sorry, come again?
So if Plato's dialogues are filled with politics, that's because he thought that politics was an important thing for his students to learn.
Por lo tanto, si los diálogos de Platón están llenos de políticas, porque pensaba que la política era algo importante para ser aprendido por sus alumnos.
And indeed, we can see what Plato thought it was important to learn by reading his dialogues.
Y evidentemente podemos ver lo que era importante para Platón para ser enseñado leyendo sus diálogos.
Right. So I think that's my answer to that question.
Y esa sería su respuesta.
Thank you, Will.
Ana, por si quieres.
Okay. Hello, Will.
Hello.
I'm going to ask the question in Spanish and then translate it, and that way I will save some work from Ricardo. Okay. En primer lugar, agradecerte la comunicación y todo el trabajo nuevamente. Creo que ya se ha dicho muchas veces esta tarde, pero creo que vale la pena repetirlo. Hemos disfrutado mucho con tu conferencia y trabajando en el orden de lectura que nos propones en los diálogos de la Torre del Virrey. Y creo que vale la pena resaltarlo. Mi pregunta ahonda un poco en la dirección de las preguntas que te ha realizado Fernando. No voy a insistir en la cuestión sobre si el filósofo, el político y el profesor deben coincidir en la misma figura, pero en la misma línea de poner en cuestión todas las cosas que merece la pena poner en cuestión, porque una vida no examinada no merece ser vivida, mi pregunta es si la República es lo que debemos aprender, lo que nos quería enseñar Platón, y en la República se habla de virtud, de justicia, y el telón de fondo es la política. ¿Significa eso que para Platón la filosofía es exclusivamente filosofía política? Creo que la pregunta es suficientemente amplia y suficientemente al mismo tiempo concreta, así que la voy a dejar ahí. Ahora voy a intentar traducirlo. So, I was insisting that I am thankful of your work, of your lecture this afternoon. We've been enjoying your works, the lecture, and working with your reading order in our dialogues of the La Torre del Virrey, and I thought it was worth mentioning it again. So, my question is lies in the line of Fernando's questions about the philosopher, the politician, and the teacher coinciding in the same figure, but I'm not going to insist on that. I want to make a question that lies in the same line, but it's not exactly the same. I wanted to know that if the Republic is indeed the book that we have to read to learn what Plato wanted to teach us, so, that is, we need to learn about justice, about virtue, and in the background of the politics, right? So does that mean that in Plato's view, philosophy is the same with political philosophy? So
yeah,
that's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So my answer to that is no. That going back to the division sign, that with respect to what lies below the plateau, that philosophy is political because it requires the philosopher to go back down into the cave. But the reason that I felt that it was necessary to amplify or alter my answer to Eric was that philosophy also soars to that which is beyond the political.
La primera respuesta era que efectivamente el filósofo debe ser político porque debe volver a la caverna, pero también quería ampliar la respuesta a Eric diciendo que además de eso político, además de eso que le lleva de vuelta abajo, hay algo que le lleva hacia arriba.
Perhaps I could illustrate what I mean by talking about the oldest trick of the absolute ruler is to present themselves as divine.
Podría poner un ejemplo de lo que está diciendo que el truco más viejo del gobernante absoluto es hacer creer a los demás que es gobernante por designación divina.
So how, for example, do we know that the Pharaoh is not divine?
Por tanto, ¿cómo podemos saber que el faraón no es divino?
How do we know that the ruler who is in control of education and of the church, how do we know that the ruler is not God's chosen leader?
¿Cómo saber que el gobernante que está a cargo de la educación o de la iglesia no es gobernante por elección divina?
We know that the ruler is not God because God is God.
Sabemos que el gobernante no es Dios porque Dios es Dios.
So without realizing that God is God, you can't know that the ruler isn't God.
Así que sin darte cuenta de que Dios es Dios, no te puedes dar cuenta de que el gobernante no es Dios.
And knowing that the ruler isn't God is the key to Platonic politics.
Y darse cuenta de que el gobernante no es Dios es la clave para la política platónica.
So there's no political philosophy without God, and there's and precisely because tyrants always masquerade as God. They've been doing it since Egypt, and they'll continue to do it forever.
No hay política sin Dios y además los gobernantes absolutos han estado siempre enmascarándose detrás de la idea de Dios, lo han estado haciendo desde los faraones y lo harán para siempre.
And the reason I doubled myself back in answering Eric is that I don't in any way want to conceal the absolute centrality of something higher than the world for Plato's politics. There's something better than politics. Let me see if I could put it this way. Aristotle raises the question of which is better, the active or the contemplative life.
El motivo para volver sobre esto con la respuesta de Eric es que no quería ocultar su pensamiento de que hay algo por encima del mundo habitual. Aristóteles se hace la pregunta de qué es mejor, una vida activa o una vida contemplativa.
And he comes up with the observation that the contemplative life is better.
Y llega a la conclusión de que la vida contemplativa es mejor.
Which it is.
Y de hecho lo es.
And Plato knows that it is.
Y Platón sabe que lo es.
The difference is,
la diferencia está,
is that Aristotle believes that since it is better, it should be chosen.
En que Aristóteles considera que puesto que lo es, debe ser escogida esa vida contemplativa.
Whereas Plato thinks that precisely because it is only better for you, it should not be chosen.
Mientras que Platón considera que puesto que es mejor para ti, no debe ser escogida.
The simplest discovery I have made about Plato is why he says so little about the idea of the good.
El más grande descubrimiento que ha hecho sobre Platón es por qué habla tan poco, por qué dice tan poco sobre la idea de bien.
And that's because all he has to say about the idea of the good is that it is not the good for me. It is not my good. It is not my happiness. It is the absolute good.
Y es que lo único que tiene que decir sobre la idea de bien es que no es el bien para mí, no es mi bien, no es mi felicidad, sino que es el bien absoluto, es el bien para todos.
And so that illustrates the degree to which Plato's philosophy is political is the degree to which he discovered a higher truth beyond politics that revealed the lie at the heart of what the world considers political.
Y donde radica la importancia de lo político en la filosofía de Platón es en que Platón se da cuenta de que hay algo más allá de lo político, más elevado, donde radica, donde también está el centro de lo que generalmente se ha malinterpretado como lo que todo el mundo considera correcto.
Right. That only the trans-political illustrates the political. And only the trans-political illuminates the political.
Solo lo que trasciende lo político ilumina lo político.
Okay. Thanks for that question. That was a nice one.
Thank you, William.
Oh, no, let's get Nathaniel. First of all, Nathaniel, you were a great audience. It was great fun. It was great fun watching your face while I was talking. You're a very lively person, and it was a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited. Let me ask you a question, first in Spanish and later in English.
Okay.
Muy corta. En el Gorgias, fragmento 521d, Sócrates dice a Calícles: creo que soy uno de los pocos, por no decir el único en Atenas, que intenta o que ejercita el verdadero arte de la política. Mi pregunta sería, ¿cómo interpreta el profesor Altman esta afirmación de Sócrates de que él es el único que intenta el verdadero arte de la política? My question. In Gorgias 521d, Socrates says to Callicles, I think I am one of few, not to say the only one in Athens, who attempts the true art of politics. My question is, how do you understand this true art of politics in the figure of Platonic Socrates?
I really think, Nathaniel, that this, thanks to the questions that I, not thanks to the paper that I gave, but thanks to the questions that I have been asked, I've been answering that question the entire time.
El profesor Altman considera que no gracias a la conferencia, a la charla que nos ha dado, sino a las preguntas que ha estado respondiendo durante esta velada, ha estado también respondiendo a esa pregunta a lo largo de este tiempo.
If it weren't for Gorgias 521, I couldn't have answered the questions the way I've answered them.
Si no fuera por Gorgias 521, no podría haber respondido a las preguntas de esta tarde.
All of my answers have been based on that important text that you quote.
Todas sus respuestas están basadas en ese importante texto que has citado.
Socrates is the true politikos.
Sócrates es el auténtico político.
And Plato revealed the essence of that with the allegory of the cave.
Y Platón revela la esencia de eso en su alegoría de la caverna.
That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Gracias.
Will, I'm going to give my hand to José Ignacio because he hasn't talked yet.
Okay.
José Ignacio, si quieres hablar.
Vale, ¿se me escucha? ¿Aló? ¿Sí se me escucha
Okay,
bien?
José, we hear. Yeah.
Ok. Mi pregunta es, primero, estoy muy sorprendido con usted, profesor Altman. Me parece un hombre supremamente inteligente. Mi pregunta es, en una situación hipotética, Platón es candidato a presidente y tiene un adversario que no es filósofo. Posteriormente, Platón pierde la elección contra este candidato que no es filósofo. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué clase de juicio se podría llegar a sacar a partir de allí? Porque entonces Platón no es más que una persona, lo convertiría eso en una persona ingenua, porque él quiere ser
él quiere aspirar a un cargo político, pero no es capaz de ejercer un cargo político si no está dispuesto a hacer lo que realmente debe llegar a ser una persona para llegar a dicho cargo. Me remito entonces de que tengo la idea de que Maquiavelo, en su obra El Príncipe, es una persona, ejerciendo la comparación, es una persona realista e inteligente. Platón, en cambio, es solamente una persona inteligente y ya, porque al haber en esa situación hipotética perdido la elección, su obra en teoría pasaría a perder validez, ¿no? Porque no llegó a dar los frutos que él quería, que es ejercer un cargo político.
Okay, Jose Ignacio is presenting us with a hypothetical situation, okay? And he says, let's imagine that Plato runs for president, okay? Versus against a non-philosopher, okay? And let's say that he loses the election. And then Jose Ignacio says, what can we learn from that? Wouldn't it be true that Plato, in a way, is naive because he wants to rule, but he is not up to do what it takes to really win an election, to really rule? And then he believes that comparing Plato with Machiavelli, we could say that Machiavelli is both realist and intelligent, while Plato would be only intelligent because maybe in this hypothetical situation, he wouldn't be ready to do what it takes to reach power.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, Plato did not run and would never have run for political office in Athens.
Antes de nada, bueno, es una pregunta muy interesante, pero recuerda que Platón nunca se postuló por ningún puesto político en Atenas.
And I say that not because Plato was too great to do so.
Y no lo dice porque fuera muy grande para hacerlo, muy importante para hacerlo.
I don't think Plato was capable of doing it. I think his gifts lay in another direction.
Sino porque considera que era incapaz de hacerlo, que sus dones, su talento estaba en otro lugar.
As far as leading cities and leading armies, I think Xenophon was twice the man that Plato was.
En cuanto a liderar ciudades y ejércitos, considera que Jenofonte era mucho mejor que Platón en eso.
And I don't think we can learn a lot from Plato about how to run a good election, how to win one, or how to respond to losing one.
Y no cree que podamos aprender mucho en Platón sobre cómo llevar adelante unas elecciones, cómo perder las elecciones o cómo responder a esa derrota.
But that doesn't mean we can't learn a lot from Platonism about the answer to Jose's questions.
Pero eso no quiere decir que no podamos aprender mucho en el platonismo sobre la respuesta a la pregunta de José Ignacio.
As you might know, that in the United States, our edition of classical text, which is called the Loeb Library of Classics, consists of both Latin and Greek books, with the Latin or Greek on one side and the English translation on the other.
Como sabrás, la edición de los clásicos en Estados Unidos sería lo equivalente en español a la edición crítica, con los textos latinos o griegos en un lado y la traducción al inglés en el otro.
One of the most important things I've learned from the Loeb Library of Classics are the names of the 3 authors whose writings are the most voluminous in that series. In other words, the 3 authors whose works are the longest when measured by those Loeb volumes.
Una de las cosas que aprendió de esa edición de clásicos que tienen en Estados Unidos es el nombre de los 3 autores cuyas obras son las más voluminosas en cuanto a extensión en esos libros.
One of them is Aristotle.
Uno es Aristóteles.
The other 2 directly bear on Jose's question.
Los otros 2 tienen que ver con la pregunta de José.
In Latin, by far the most prolific author in the Loeb Library is Cicero.
En latín, de lejos, el autor más prolífico en esa edición es Cicerón.
And even more prolific than Aristotle in Greek is Plutarch.
Y aún más prolífico que Aristóteles en griego es Plutarco.
Now, Plutarch is famous for writing the parallel lives.
Plutarco es famoso por escribir las vidas paralelas.
But he should be equally famous for writing a long series of Platonic essays called the Moralia.
Pero también debería ser famoso por escribir una serie de ensayos platónicos llamados Moralia.
And although very few of the statesmen that he describes in the parallel lives are philosophers,
Y aunque muy pocos de los hombres de Estado que describen las vidas paralelas son filósofos,
every time a philosopher reads Plutarch's lives, they're learning about politics.
cada vez que un filósofo lee las vidas de Plutarco, está aprendiendo sobre política.
And since Plutarch wrote for philosophers, then you have a combination of politics and philosophy every time anybody reads one of those lives.
Cada vez que alguien lee una de esas vidas, encuentra una combinación de filosofía y política.
Those lives answer José's question.
Esas vidas responden a la pregunta de José.
Just as Cicero's writings answer it as well.
Así como la escritura, como las obras de Cicerón también responden a esa pregunta.
Not Plato himself provides the answer, but Plato's students provide the answer.
No es Platón el que nos da la respuesta, sino los estudiantes de Platón.
Demosthenes, Cicero, and Plutarch illustrate the way a philosopher would respond to losing a political contest with a non-philosopher.
Demóstenes, Cicerón y Plutarco muestran la respuesta que un filósofo daría ante el evento de perder unas elecciones o una rivalidad en unas
So if
elecciones.
Jose is interested in answering his question, there's plenty of ammunition he can find to answer it.
Por tanto, si José tiene interés en responder a su pregunta, tiene muchísima munición para hacerlo.
But not Plato's dialogues.
Pero no en los diálogos de Platón.
Except to say that philosophy is a practice for death, and that losing an election doesn't look terribly bad to a person that truly is a philosopher.
Más allá de que en los diálogos de Platón aprendemos que la filosofía es una práctica para la muerte y que visto así, perder unas elecciones tampoco es tan grave.
Yeah.
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Thanks for the question, Jose. It was a nice one.
Thanks to you.
Adolfo, tenías la mano levantada. Yo quería preguntarle, Will, how long, do we take this question from Adolfo and then you close the session? Or do we?
Look,
No, María, por favor, si tú tienes una pregunta, hazla tú. Yo
Es
la
que la
bajo.
mía al final se ha ido de un poco de... Hazlo tú si quieres.
Vale, como quieras.
But, Will, if you can... I lost you. There you are. Then you want to answer this and close the session?
Whatever you think best, Maria. It's your show. I'll stay as long as you want me. That's fine.
That's not an easy way to answer.
No, I don't have a better answer than that.
For me, but anyway.
Oh.
Adolfo.
Well, first of all, Maria, let me say that I've enjoyed this very much, and that, I'm at your disposal in any way I can be helpful. Look, one thing I would say to all of my Spanish friends is that I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Eu tenho uma pergunta para vocês. ¿Por qué? Porque os alunos, particularmente en España, en español, why is it that the people that have been most interested in my work are located in Valencia and Bogota? Like, why is that? Why is it that I am a vox clamantis in deserto in my own country, where nobody is paying particular attention to anything that I have to say, and that, I understand nobody is a prophet in their hometown. I understand that, but I don't understand why the one place where my work has resonance is in Spanish-speaking countries. I don't understand that, and I would like that explained to me.
El profesor Altman se pregunta por qué es que su obra tiene tanta resonancia en Valencia y en Bogotá. Se siente una voz clamando en el desierto en su propio país, en Estados Unidos nadie le presta ni puñetera atención, y él asume que efectivamente es muy difícil ser profeta en su tierra, pero aún así su pregunta sigue siendo la misma. ¿Por qué él se siente tan acogido y su obra tan resonante en los países de habla hispana?
Puedo responder. Le traduces, Ricardo, por favor. De lo que ocurre en Bogotá no soy responsable. Esto es claro. Will, la respuesta tiene que ver con lo siguiente. Es una respuesta personal. Yo me consideraba un buen straussiano. Creía haber entendido muchas cosas leyendo a Leo Strauss. Hasta que leí un libro de un tal William Altman sobre el extranjero alemán, en el que se decía que Leo Strauss era poco más o menos que un nazi.
Voy a ir
Toda mi
traduciendo.
dedicación.
Antonio says that he has nothing to do with what is going on in Bogota, but as a personal answer to that, he says that he considered himself a very good Straussian until he read a work of a man who said that basically Leo Strauss was little more than a Nazi.
Yeah, I know that man.
Entiendo que muchos straussianos reaccionaran arrojando el libro de William Altman a la basura.
He understands that many Straussians reacted throwing the book by William Altman into the bin, to the trash.
Exactly.
Ese no fue mi caso. Porque me había dado cuenta de dos cosas. Una, de que seguía siendo straussiano a pesar del libro de William Altman.
It wasn't his case because he came to realize two things. First, that he continued being a Straussian even though despite your book.
Y particularmente ha resonado esta tarde en tu conferencia con la palabra reorientación. Es una palabra típicamente straussiana.
And Strauss has resonated in your conference with the word reorientation, which is a typically Straussian word.
Pero me di cuenta de que era mucho más importante para mí volver a hacer con Altman lo que había hecho con Leo Strauss, volver a leer a Platón, de acuerdo con lo que las correcciones de Altman a Leo Strauss sugerían.
But second, he realized that it was very important to do again with Altman what he had done with Strauss, which was reading back Plato with the corrections that Altman had made on Strauss.
Y tengo la inmensa suerte, Will, de tener muchos amigos que me hacen caso cuando les digo algunas cosas. Y empecé a hablar de William Altman, de los libros de William Altman, y mis amigos empezaron a pensar que William Altman primero me lo había inventado yo.
And he's so lucky to have a lot of friends who listen to him when he has something to say. And he started talking about William Altman. And first of all, his friends thought that he had made up William Altman.
Y descubrir que William Altman existía en realidad fue una bendición para todos nosotros.
And discovering that William Altman really exists was a real blessing for all of us.
Además, William Altman respondió a la carta que un straussiano le envió, Maisel, diciéndole que era un straussiano.
Furthermore, William Altman answered the letter of an Straussian who said, hello, here's an Straussian.
Y a partir de ahí empezamos a leer los libros de William Altman. Mi respuesta, Will, es que mi extrañeza es que el mundo académico no se haya dado cuenta de lo que la pentalogía que has escrito supone para los estudios de Plato.
Basically, his
Esta
answer
es mi verdad.
that he cannot understand how the academic world hasn't realized how important your 5 books about Plato are.
No,
Entonces,
that's easy to explain. They haven't read them. They've never looked at them. They've paid no attention to them at all. Two of my 5 books have never even been reviewed.
Es una respuesta fácil. No los han leído, no les han prestado atención. 2 de sus 5 libros nunca han tenido una reseña.
Nosotros pensamos que la mejor manera de leer los libros es traducir los libros.
We think that the best way of reading a book is translating it.
Right. But I mean, all this does is it returns the question to its origin. And you know, Antonio, I'm pleased to hear your account of your personal journey that began with Leo Strauss. But that doesn't satisfy me as to the overall answer to the question. And so I'd like to offer a hypothesis as to why this, because all I can say is that my friend Alfonso Flores in Bogota, I don't think he came to me with any interest in Strauss whatsoever. It was a completely different route. I think, especially linking when Antonio said, does this guy, like, I had to be sure that the guy exists, like that William Altman exists. And then, look, maybe it's a very limited view of Spanish culture. And obviously, I'm not from a Spanish-speaking country, but I've got to believe that the solution to my question has to do with what I might call the quixotic nature of my project, as we would say in English. In other words, I'm clearly an idealist, and I'm clearly fighting against windmills. And I ride off into this world that has been dominated by Aristotle for thousands of years, and have the audacity to, well, as we would say in English, dream the impossible dream. You know, we made a musical out of Don Quixote called the Man of La Mancha, and it might surprise or not surprise you to hear that I played Don Quixote and the Man of La Mancha. I've sung those songs. And I enjoyed singing them, and I sang them as a Platonist. And I believe personally that the story of the retired public high school teacher who lacks the credentials of having gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, that somehow or another that resonates, particularly in Spanish-speaking countries, because it is idealistic and willing to follow a dream. So now that I've made my hypothesis, does anybody think that that's true, or can anybody prove that false? Because I really want to know the answer to this question, and I don't offer the hypothesis with any certainty. I cannot believe that it is an accident. Yes, it's true that Antonio, what came to me through Strauss, and we became friends, and he invited me, and I don't want to belittle the personal, and obviously, on some sense, all of you guys are here because of Antonio. I mean, this is the Torre de Virrey, and on the other hand, the last time I checked, there were 35 of you in this room, and it's not just that, there's something in this. And of course, your questions were so good. They were all about how to live this, like how to actually live it. Like, what is politics and philosophy? How do you actually live this? I can't tell you how foreign that is to the way any people in the United States, even friends of mine, respond to my work. It's just very, very, very different.
Si te parece, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to translate so far.
Please.
El profesor Altman comenta que en realidad la respuesta de Antonio no acaba de satisfacerle porque, por ejemplo, Alfonso Flores en Bogotá no es straussiano, no ha llegado por la misma vía que Antonio. Sin embargo, dice que él tiene una hipótesis y que le gustaría presentarla para ver qué nos parece. No quiere hacer de menos, efectivamente, la importancia que Antonio ha tenido y la Torre del Virrey ha tenido y la forma en la que la gente que nos reunimos en torno a este proyecto bueno, pues vivimos esta experiencia de William Altman intentando encontrar una forma de vivir el platonismo y sus enseñanzas, pero él dice, tiene una hipótesis, y la hipótesis radica en que aunque él no es español, no ha vivido en España, tiene una cualidad que él llamaría quijotesca, que él se ve a sí mismo como un Quijote luchando contra los molinos de viento. Molinos de viento que son Aristóteles, una tradición de 2000 años. Y dice precisamente que en Estados Unidos hay un musical sobre la figura del Quijote llamado El hombre de la Mancha, de Man of la Mancha, y que él mismo en ocasiones ha cantado las canciones correspondientes al Quijote de ese musical. Y él cree que siendo un profesor de instituto retirado, que no viene de un ámbito académico, excusad el término, pijo, estilo Harvard o Yale, es algo así como una figura quijotesca, alguien que en principio no debería ser nadie en particular, pero que sin embargo está llevando a cabo un sueño que a él le parece fundamental, que es oponerse a una concepción errónea de la filosofía de Platón y que de algún modo, y esa es la hipótesis que le gustaría comprobar con nosotros, de algún modo considera que en los países de habla hispana ese espíritu quijotesco se ha visto reconocido y acogido de una forma que no solamente en Estados Unidos, pero ni siquiera sus amigos en Estados Unidos han sido capaces de igualar. Me he dejado algunos detalles por ser una respuesta extensa, pero creo que los he recogido todos.
Will, let me add something. Déjame añadir algo. Que es personal y no lo es. Tiene que ver con el hecho de que en España, y creo también que en los países de habla hispana, en general en los países de vieja tradición católica, la filosofía no ha desaparecido de la enseñanza secundaria.
Antonio believes that part of the answers could be that in Spain and also in the Spanish-speaking language, in the countries with a long Catholic tradition, philosophy hasn't disappeared from the secondary school.
Y la mayor parte de las personas que forman la Torre del Virrey tienen que ver con la enseñanza secundaria vocacionalmente.
And the most of the people who are part of La Torre are part of this secondary school teaching, vocationally
Right.
part of that.
Right.
De manera que Plato de teacher resounds in our hearts. It's not Plato de Herr Professor, Herr Gelehrter Professor.
Yeah.
Plato de teacher suena muy cerca de lo que cada uno de nosotros tiene que hacer. Esta es una razón personal y no personal. Muchos de nosotros, no diría que somos Quijotes, pero sabemos que estamos en un terreno de excepcionalidad, puesto que la influencia protestante o la influencia de los países del norte llevará a que antes o después la filosofía desaparezca de la enseñanza secundaria.
Antonio doesn't know if this is the answer, but he believes that we live in an environment in which our situation seems to be just temporal, that the influence of the Protestant countries and the culture of the Protestant countries finally, eventually, will end up with philosophy in high school.
Say that again, Ricardo. I didn't quite understand that. The spirit of Protestantism will eventually what?
Will vanish philosophy in secondary school.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense to me in the sense that a lot of Alfonso students were training to be teachers, and my best student in Brazil is a teacher of pedagogy, and that so I think that makes some sense. I don't know. I mean, as you could see when I doubled back in answering Eric's question, which, you know, my first effort was, I mean, my first answer was a completely secular answer to Eric's question. And I tried to put a little bit of, if I may say so, God into my answer when I came around to it the second time. That quite apart from the differences between Protestant and Catholic is that what I find in my own mind repeatedly is that I just don't think that I could have written the books that I've written or thought about Plato the way that I think about Plato if I didn't believe in God. And I think this is a major factor. I don't know whether more people believe in God in Spanish-speaking countries than in my own, but I do know that I seldom encounter professors of ancient philosophy in the United States that, I mean, if you don't believe in something higher than the world, you are not going to teach Plato well. I think that you know, you can delight in the irony, and you can delight in the characters, and you can delight in the beautiful writing, but in terms of the ideas, in terms of the idea that the idea is not of this world, that you're going to eventually get lost, especially since Plato knows, in my opinion, knows that that is the basic thing that he needs to test you on. That if you are going to be willing to embody God in Socrates or in a state or in the ideal city of the laws, there's a great scene in the, I think it's in the Politicus, where, or maybe it's in the Sophist, it's in one of the two, where the Eleatic stranger asks the young man whether he believes in God or not. And the young man says something like, well, I don't really know whether I believe in God, but now looking at your face, looking into your eyes, hearing what you're saying, I do believe in God. And to me, that is a very clear proof that Plato does not speak through the Eleatic stranger, because that is a really silly reason to believe in God. You don't believe in God because some joker over here can put on a big shiny face and with glorious rhetoric start talking as if they had a personal channel to the divine. It's the oldest philosophical trick in the book. It's why my most recent book is about Plotinus. Here's a guy that could channel God talk as well as anybody that's ever written, clearly was presenting himself as having directly come from direct intercourse with the one, and that he condescends to talk to you as if that meant going back down into the cave. And, you know, it's kind of like, you know, when I said, you know, how do you know that Pharaoh's not God? How do you know that? Like, how did the Hebrews know that Pharaoh was not God? Like, how do you actually know that? How do you keep church and state separate? How do you actually know that the government does not speak with the voice of angels? It's only because if you don't believe in God, you'll believe that horse shit. That's all that it comes down to, that you have to believe in something higher to put a perspective on all the rest of it. And that's why I'm so moved by Maria's, when she cited the things that had most spoken to her. I mean, yeah, the California consultant, that's funny, and KGB, you know, I was trying to be humorous, but that division sign is my heart. Like, that division sign is the core of And you know, I just one word, since I've been bashing Aristotle good and proper this afternoon, especially in the paper, I do want to say that Aristotle is absolutely right that Plato believed that the mathematicals We're intermediate. It's the most important thing that the Stagirite has to say about Plato. There is no question that Plato does not believe that the numbers and geometry are the ideas. And the paradox, of course, is that they're the easiest way to teach the ideas. Right-angled triangularity, like the idea of the triangle. And by the way, I want to say that since you guys are going to be reading, are devoting this next unit to the Republic, is that more and more I'm convinced that in reading Plato's Republic well, that you have to interrupt between book 5 and book 6 and read the 13 letters of Plato, because
We're doing
and who's going to lead the are you going to have separate people leading the discussions on the different letters, or are you going to do them all as one, Maria?
We only have time for one session, and it's going to be Ricardo's. But in fact, my question was going to be about the second letter.
De paso, invocando que habéis nombrado mi nombre, si os parece, voy a intentar traducir algo de los últimos 10 minutos. Sorry, William, I'm going to try to translate a bit of what you said in the last minutes. It's okay. I'll try my best. Otherwise,
you're doing a great job as always.
Subtitles for YouTube. The thing is that he was intrigued and he agreed that teaching had something to do with the good response to his. ¿Por qué lo estoy diciendo otra vez en inglés? Maldita sea. Decía que.
I thought you were going to say all this in Spanish to them, right?
Yeah.
I'll be right back. I'm going to
was
go to the washroom for a minute.
I was confused. William decía que le parecía correcto esa idea de que tenía algo que ver eso de ser profesores en la buena recepción que su obra había tenido. Y precisamente comentaba que algunos de los estudiantes de ese amigo suyo, Alfonso Flores, en Bogotá, se están preparando para ser profesores. Su mejor alumno en Brasil era estudiante de pedagogía, y comentaba efectivamente que, bueno, algo tenía que ver. Y en ese momento pasaba hacia una explicación que tenía algo más que ver con la cuestión de, él comentaba, bueno, no voy a abundar mucho en la separación entre el catolicismo y el protestantismo, pero entraba a decir que efectivamente en su explicación, en su forma de entender a Platón, en aquello que está haciendo, hay de fondo una profunda creencia en Dios, en que hay algo por encima de nosotros, por encima de todo, que guía de algún modo. No obstante, no estaba, y ha hecho mucho hincapié en ello, intentando hacernos caer en esa concepción bobalicona de la divinidad que intentaba presentar en una escena en la que el extranjero eleata preguntaba al joven, ¿crees en Dios? Y entonces el joven le respondía, bueno, no estoy muy seguro, pero viéndote la cara, los ojos que tienes y la expresión cuando estábamos hablando, yo creo que sí, que creo en Dios. Y Altman comentaba que evidentemente la forma de creer en Dios no es a través de la cara angelical de cualquier papanatas que te esté hablando. De hecho, dice que no es casualidad que su último libro sea sobre Plotino, que consideraba que estaba en conexión directa con el uno y que de algún modo, bueno, pues se rebajaba a explicar a los mortales aquello que en esa conexión con la divinidad había sido capaz de llegar a conocer. Volvía a abundar en aquello que había comentado en una respuesta anterior. ¿Cómo sabes que el faraón no es la divinidad? O nos lo acercaba todavía más, ¿cómo mantenemos la separación entre Dios y Estado si no tenemos la creencia adecuada en lo que es la divinidad, en algo que está por encima, que no tiene que ver con el Estado en particular, sino que es una especie de guía más allá? Y comentaba que efectivamente, aunque agradecía a María que se hubiera fijado en esas expresiones que él utiliza, como lo de KGB y ese tipo de cosas, él considera que lo más importante en su obra es esa idea de la división, del punto de división entre esas dos partes, lo de abajo, lo de arriba, y tener siempre claro que para entender a Platón dejadme que lo diga de este modo, no es posible entender correctamente a Platón, de verdad a Platón, si no se tiene la conciencia de que existe algo superior, de que hay algo por encima. Altman consideraba, o lo ponía en las palabras, si no se cree en Dios. Pero efectivamente hacía mucho hincapié en no entrar en esa mojigatería absurda estilo plotinista. Y comentaba también que había estado dándole mucha candela, mucha candela a Aristóteles, pero quería decir algo en su favor, y es que Aristóteles estaba absolutamente en lo cierto cuando consideraba que las matemáticas eran la forma más simple de intentar explicarnos lo que eran las ideas, de que era el tránsito importante para pasar de uno a otro. Y esperando que toda esta traducción haya tenido algún sentido, acababa la intervención con un intercambio con María porque comentaba que era muy importante que en la lectura de los diálogos de la República se hiciera una pausa entre los libros quinto y sexto, ¿correcto? Para leer las cartas, a lo que María había recordado que había alguien entre nosotros con bastante poco talento que seguramente se vería en la situación de ocuparse de las cartas. Así que por ahí estábamos. William, si estás ahí, manifiéstate. William, if you are there, manifest yourself.
Si os parece bien, le podemos dar a William, ¿no? La ocasión de despedirse si regresa. Parece que ha salido al jardín en
Sí.
Vermont.
Típico fin de fiesta flamenco.
Ahí está. Estaba recogiendo un paquete de FedEx.
No, María, ¿le das la voz para que cierre o querías tú hacerle la última pregunta? Como veamos.
Solo iba a preguntarle por la carta segunda, pero igual no es necesario.
Sí, por favor, preguntaré.
No, I was going to ask you, Will, if everything that you've been talking about this last minutes had something to do with the explanation between Book 5 and the paradox. The second letter with the Phantom Basileus here, and the going down to the cave. Y para los demás quería preguntar si todo lo que está diciendo ahora de creer en Dios y la enseñanza guardaba algún tipo de relación con el libro quinto y la paradoja de los gobernantes, bueno, de que el filósofo gobernante, y en particular la tercera parte de la paradoja, the third part of the paradox, una mención que hay en la segunda carta de el rey de todas las cosas, Phantom Basile, y bajar a la caverna.
You got it there, William?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Did you get the question?
Yeah, I think I need a little bit more clarification on it.
Maria was saying was wondering if there's a connection between the fifth book of the Republic, correct me here, Maria, if I'm saying it wrong, and this part in the second letter which talks about the king of all things, and if it has a relation, I was saying, with this third part of the paradox in the fifth book of the Republic.
And
I don't know.
Going down.
I don't know. I don't know, but what I can say about the second letter comes directly out of my recent work on Plotinus, who quotes that passage about the king of all and the second things and the third things again and again and again and again.
Todo lo que puedo decir sobre eso es referido a sus últimas lecturas y obras sobre Plotino, que cita ese pasaje sobre el rey de todas las cosas y las segundas y terceras cosas una y otra vez, una y otra vez.
And he never bothers to quote and doesn't seem to have read what Plato says immediately after that passage.
Y no se molesta en citar, ni siquiera parece que haya leído, lo que Platón dice inmediatamente después de ese pasaje.
As far as relating that passage to going back down into the cave, I just don't know.
En cuanto a poner en relación ese pasaje con la idea de volver a la cueva, no lo tiene claro.
But I believe it can be shown that the letters as a whole, looked at as an integrated work of art,
Pero desde luego considera que las cartas como conjunto se pueden mostrar como una obra de arte perfectamente integrada.
clearly do bear on what the philosopher does on leaving the academy and on going back down into the cave.
Y que tiene que ver mucho con lo que el filósofo hace en la academia o vive en la academia y con volver a la caverna.
And that it seems to me that if anybody is going to ever give an adequate account of Plato's letters, that they will be able to do so by availing themselves of the hypothesis that the letters are directly linked to the Republic and specifically to the third wave of paradox.
Y que si alguien en algún momento va a dar una interpretación correcta de las cartas será tomando la hipótesis de que están directamente relacionadas con ese libro quinto de la República y particularmente con la tercera forma de la paradoja.
I mean, one of the nice things that I feel about, well, let me tell you a story about a student of mine.
Dejadme que os cuente una historia de un estudiante mío, suyo.
I have a friend named Pedro who has been teaching Plato's Lysis.
Tengo un amigo llamado Pedro que ha estado enseñando el Lysis de Plato.
And he called me up the other day and said, I figured out another reason why Lysis is followed directly by Euthydemus.
Y le llamó el otro día y dijo, me acabo de dar cuenta de otro motivo por el que el Lysis es seguido por el Eutidemo.
And then he started to laugh and he said, because Crito is Socrates' friend.
Y empezó a reírse y dijo, porque Critón es el amigo de Sócrates.
And then he just talked briefly about what a good friend Crito was to Socrates and how respectful he is and whether, he's testing whether he's being serious or not. And that it's just so funny that Plato put a dialogue where Crito is Socrates' great friend right after a dialogue on friendship. In other words, that the Euthydemus, as Pedro said, the Euthydemus answers the question, what is friendship?
Y se dio cuenta de que Critón era tan buen amigo de Sócrates que, bueno, pues está siempre tratándole con muchísimo respeto, intentando saber si Sócrates, bueno, pues está yendo en serio o no y tal y cual. Y entonces este amigo de Altman consideró que era una gran idea poner después de ese diálogo el diálogo sobre la amistad que es el Eutidemo.
And so I said to my friend Pedro, this is great, I said.
Y le dije a Pedro, maravilloso.
It's so simple, it's so elegant, but I had never seen it.
Es tan simple y tan elegante, pero nunca lo había visto así.
And this is what I would like. I mean, to say that I am deeply honored by this seminar and your attention to my work is an understatement.
Decir que estoy complacido por este seminario y por la atención de la torre a su trabajo es quedarse corto.
It's a great honor for me and a privilege, and it's just beyond words.
Es un honor, un privilegio y no tiene palabras para expresarlo.
But I strongly feel that the greatest merit of my work
Pero cree que el más importante mérito de su trabajo
is that it will prompt people that I've never met
es que permitirá a gente que nunca ha conocido
to have the kind of ideas that my friend Pedro did.
tener las ideas, el tipo de ideas que su amigo Pedro tuvo.
I mean, I could see that Pedro wouldn't have had that idea if it weren't for what I had taught him.
Él cree que a Pedro no se le hubiera ocurrido esa idea de poner este diálogo detrás del otro, a no ser, de no ser por lo que había aprendido de William Altman.
And yet it was an idea that I had not taught him and that he was teaching me.
Y aún así era una idea que a Altman no se le había ocurrido y que Pedro le estaba enseñando a él.
And I'd like to think that simply using reading order as a set of clues will help people to understand Plato more clearly.
Y que sencillamente utilizar el orden de lectura que él nos proporciona como un conjunto de pistas ayudará a la gente a entender los escritos de Platón.
So I'm never going to write a book about how Plato's letters is illuminated by the hypothesis that it follows Book 5 and precedes Book 6 in the Republic. I'm never going to write that book, but I hope somebody will, because I think it would illuminate the letters in a way that they've never been illuminated.
Nunca va a escribir un libro sobre cómo él considera que las cartas deben estar insertas en el orden de lectura en el lugar que él propone, pero considera que efectivamente alguien debería, porque desde luego va a ser un libro muy iluminador.
I'd like to tell one more story, Ricardo, and this will put a real burden on translation, because I think it will be hard to translate, but it's a story about how I once delivered a lecture on Greek tragedy to a group of students that I had never taught before.
Quiere contarnos la historia de cómo una vez dio una clase sobre la tragedia griega a un grupo de estudiantes a los que nunca había dado clase.
And a young woman who had been in the class came up to me several days later and said to me, "Oh, Mr. Altman, that was such an inciting lecture."
Y una joven que había estado en la clase unos días más tarde fue a hablar con él y dijo, fue una clase maravillosa, muy interesante.
Okay, so now the key here, Ricardo, is the word inciting. She said it was a very inciting lecture. And then I said, "What did you say?" And she said it was a very exciting lecture.
Ok, ella utilizó primero la palabra inciting, que imagino que en ese contexto tendría que ver con la capacidad de sight, de vista, dentro de una clase que había permitido ver dentro de la tragedia griega, de lo que estaba. Y entonces el profesor dijo, perdón, ¿cómo has dicho? Y dijo, excitante, no inciting, but exciting.
So I said, no, that's not what you said. You said inciting. And then I said, how do you spell that?
Y entonces le dijo, no has dicho exciting, no has dicho excitante, has dicho inciting. ¿Cómo deletreas inciting?
So there are two ways you could spell it. INCITE, like to incite a riot. To incite a riot.
Hay dos formas de deletrear la misma forma de pronunciar inciting. Una que viene de incite, incitar, como quien incita a una revuelta.
Exactamente. But in English, we also, of course, have the word insight. In other words, that's a teacher of great insight, or that's a guru with great insight, meaning, great perception. That's INSIGHT.
Y por supuesto está la otra forma, que es a la que me estaba refiriendo antes, de in y n y sight, de vista, refiriéndose a un profesor con mucho insight, aquel que es capaz de ver en profundidad la materia a la que se dedica.
And what I cited is what this young woman had said was she had invented a new word, which was to say that my lectures were inciting. In other words, INSIGHTING, because they had planted in her insight, that they had incited her to be insightful, the way I felt that I had incited Pedro to be, that they were inciting.
Y el juego de palabras al que se refiere es que le gustaría pensar que esta joven utilizó un nuevo verbo que combinaba las dos, que de algún modo la clase del profesor Altman la había incitado a ser profunda en el estudio de aquello que estaba relacionado con la clase. Del mismo modo que la obra de Altman había invitado a su amigo Pedro a tener una visión más profunda de ese orden de lectura que a él nunca se le había ocurrido.
And what could be better than that? I mean, what could be more what could be better than that is that if a teacher truly knows that what they're doing is offering the student a springboard to go beyond the teacher.
¿Y qué puede haber mejor que pensar, si eres profesor, que le estás proporcionando a los estudiantes un trampolín para ir más allá de ti mismo?
What could be better than that?
¿Qué puede ser mejor que eso?
And by the way, that's a lot about what my book about Plato and Xenophon is about.
Por cierto, su libro sobre Platón y Jenofonte tiene que ver mucho con esto.
Because I'm claiming that Plato could not have been the great writer that he was if he hadn't been influenced strongly by Xenophon.
Porque afirma que Platón no podría haber sido el gran escritor que fue de no haber sido de algún modo incitado por Jenofonte.
And my greatest hope to all of you, my friends in Valencia, is that you will have insights about Plato that go far beyond my own.
Y su esperanza para todos nosotros, para sus amigos en Valencia, es que lleguemos a tener muchas insights en el sentido de visiones profundas gracias a su obra.
Thank you very much, William.
Yeah.
Ricardo, me gustaría preguntarle si podemos publicar en nuestra revista la conferencia,
Claro.
tanto en inglés como en español.
Antonio is asking if you allow us to publish your conference, your today's conference, in English and in Spanish in our magazine.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Gracias muchas a todos. It's a great honor for me, and it was a delight. Thank you. We've been here for almost 3 hours, and you've just been very patient and interested. I'm just so moved and humbled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you very much.
María, cerramos
Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, if anyone has anything to say, or really if you want to close or leave it like that.
I'm fine. I said what I needed to say, I think, from the heart.
Thank you very much, Will.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.
We will begin our course on the Republic next month. Alvaro is going to give the first book. So, yeah.
Well, good luck to all of you, and may you enjoy the Republic. And I'm very eager to see what will happen when you go on to Timaeus and Critias and Phaedrus, Parmenides and Philebus. Good luck to all of you, and much love. Thank you for all of your kindness and interest in my work. It's very, very special for me. And thank you, Ricardo. You're the greatest translator. It's so nice to see you again, my friend. Esmeralda, again,
you very well about my speech, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Will.
And Antonio, thank you so much for making all of this possible. Thank you, my friend. I'm very, very grateful, and so nice to see you again.
See you soon, Will.
Okay, good.
Bye.
Bye-bye, friends. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.